study, and this was developed as a series. I was supposed to do a series of videos for House to House last week, and then I stepped on that hose Sunday night and smoked myself in the eye. And so you don't want to make a bunch of church videos with a big old black eye hanging out. And so hopefully in about 2 or 3 days I'll get well enough that it won't be so obvious, and I can make these make the videos for House to House. We actually studied a book by the title of this on why do people not see the Bible alike. It's a book written in 1949 by J. Ridley Stroop. And J. Ridley Stroop was a Bible teacher and a world-renowned psychologist. In fact, you can Google, please don't while I'm talking, but you can Google the Stroop effect. The Stroop effect. And it has something to do with reading colors, reading words of colors with them in the color that they're in and in a different color. Like the word blue might be in red, and how there can be a disassociation between in your mind. You see blue, but it's in red, and you say red. All right, and so Stroop came up with that a long time ago. And it's a well in those circles, it's a well-known thing. And so, but Stroop was so insightful in this book. And if you still have a copy of it, I encourage you to go back and read it again. But don't read it unless you want to be challenged. Because I remember teaching that book and reading some things that he would say at the start of his chapters, and I'm like, I don't think I agree with that. And then I got to the end of the chapter, and I think I agree with that. I mean, he never said anything without making his case, and in a biblical way. And so it's a great work, and I highly recommend it. But some of these, or a lot of these, come out of this, and then some of these came out of a Spiritual Sword article years ago. And I was on a podcast for the Spiritual Sword when I was in Branson in July at PTP. And the discussion one of the discussions I had on the podcast was, can we see the Bible alike? So I went back and I studied the Stroop material. I went back and studied the Spiritual Sword article that was the impetus behind the podcast. And I compiled this list of 6 things that are very general on why people do not see the Bible alike. I don't know that we'll get through all of them. If we don't get through all of them tonight, next week is singing night, so we'll come back before Sunday night and finish up. But I want to think about some of these as we make our way through this study. Why do people not see the Bible alike? And I think number one is the number one answer. And the number one answer is ignorance of the Bible. Ignorance of the Bible. People don't see the Bible alike because they don't know the Bible. You know, in Hosea 4 and verse 6, you know, the prophet said, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." A lack of knowledge. And so you know, it's important for us. It is important for us to be biblically literate. You know, if you spend, and this is probably peculiar or particular, not just to our area, but to the people that we associate with, because you know this is still generally a pretty religious area. You know, most everybody affiliates with some type of religious group, and so you know, but you start reading social media, and you'll find out how ignorant people are of the Bible in a hurry, where they use words and phrases that cannot be found nor defended in the Scriptures, and it's just a barrage of biblical ignorance. And at the same time, it's not just people that are not members of the church. You know, if you ever get involved in any type of by the way, I avoid these groups like the plague, but there's all these groups in the church that want to discuss things. But basically all they want to do is parrot what they've heard for the last 50 years without studying the matter. They haven't spent 5 seconds studying the matter. And that's a big problem in the church. You know, that people might know what is right, but they don't even know why it's right. It's just the way it's what I was taught. It's how I was raised. And so just because people may have the right answer doesn't mean they're not ignorant. Is that right? I mean, for example, if you gave me a physics test, but you gave me all the answers to the test and let me memorize the answers, I could make 100 on that physics test. But I'd still be ignorant about physics or chemistry or whatever scientific discipline you want to lay out there. And so simply knowing the right answer doesn't mean that a person is not ignorant. So we fall prey to that just as much, I think, just as much as any other group. And I think it's worse for us because we claim to be a people of the book. We claim to be a people who follow the Bible. But the truth is that many of us do not follow the Bible. We simply follow what we've been spoon-fed for the last 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. And that's what we believe, and that's why we believe it. So ignorance of the Bible is one thing. I opened to your Bibles to the book of Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. By the way, this thought just occurred to me, and it kind of disturbed me as I was thinking about it. In Luke 10 and verse 25, and while you're turning there, I want to ask you a question. This is a thought question. If a person does what is right, but they don't know why they are doing it, can it be called obedience? Well, what about people that walk in our buildings every single week and they know what the plan of salvation is, but they don't understand it. They don't know why. They couldn't defend it in a discussion. They know that for example, they know that the church doesn't use instrumental music in its worship, but they don't know why, and they really don't understand it, or any number. In other words, that they could do the right things, but really have no idea why they are doing it. They're simply doing it because that's what they were taught as children, and all the people that I go to church with believe the same thing, and so I'm going to keep believing that.
If they understood the plan of salvation, yes, they could. They don't have to know all the others. They would learn that.
Yeah, and that might not have been the best example. What I'm saying is, in my mind, obedience requires an understanding, maybe not of why we're doing something, but there has to be an understanding of the thing.
Well, my point was, as a new Christian is not...
No, I'm not talking about new Christians. I'm talking about people who've been Christians 20, 30, 40 years.
But I'm confused
Does
as
it
to
make you a
why they
farmer
wouldn't
because
know.
you plant a seed in the ground and it comes up, or do you understand all the genetics of how that seed comes up?
And that's why I'm tossing that out there, because there is a sense in which we all continue to grow, right? I mean, I wouldn't begin to claim all knowledge about any one thing, any single subject in the Bible, except what the shortest verse is, all right, in the English. Because I don't remember what the shortest one is in the Greek, but it's in 1 Thessalonians. But the only thing I can say with any certainty is the shortest English verse is John 11:35. Jesus wept. Right? That's what I know with absolute certainty. Other than that, I don't know anything about all the things about any other subject. The question is, if we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, we can't even open up our Bibles and show somebody why we're just simply doing it because we were taught it as children, and we've been sitting in the church for 40 or 50 years, and we're still doing it, but we do it for the same reason people out in the religious world. We do it because that's the way we've always done it.
Well, that's crazy. If you've been in the church for 40 years, you've heard lessons on those things. You should know. I'm just saying.
I'm not arguing with you. All right. All right, let me pose this to you. If I hand wrote, or if I brought in tonight, I brought in a pop quiz, Miss Teacher. All right? If I brought in a pop quiz And I said, and here it is. I said, I want you to write all the steps in the plan of salvation and a verse that goes with them. I want a verse that explains why we sing in worship and don't have instrumental music. I want a verse that teaches, write down a verse that teaches why the church is organized. Give me one of the 2 chapters where the qualifications for elders can be found. Give me the 1 chapter where the qualifications for deacons can be found. Give me one verse that explains why once saved, always saved is not right. And if I handed that test out tonight, how many passing grades do you think we'd get?
Depends on if it's open book or not. If it's open book, I'm saying that
Yeah.
anybody that's been a Christian for 40 years should be able to do it.
Should. That's the word.
But my
Should.
point is, why do you have to have the scriptures memorized? I'm not saying I do or I don't, but I don't think you have to have the scriptures memorized to be able to show someone why instrumental music is wrong.
All right, let's say I let you have an open. What if I let you take the test with an open? What if I let you take the test with an open book, but I didn't give you 12 hours to finish it?
Well, I wouldn't need 12 hours.
But you see what I'm saying?
Because if you gave me that test, I'll just be honest, I've been a Christian for over 40 years. I don't really know how long, but anyway.
Sir?
I was flawed.
Flunk. But if I let you have the Bible open, could you do it in a reasonable amount of time? You think you could?
Yes.
I might put y'all to the test on that.
I'm just gonna,
We might show up with a pop test here before very long.
I don't think you're giving people enough credit.
I just posed a question. Can you obey if you don't know why you're doing what you're
And
doing?
I understood the question, I just couldn't find.
And somehow we got off on this. But you know,
They know why, I mean, they know why they're doing it, but to pinpoint it and turn you right to it at that second.
isn't that kind of the point, though?
Wouldn't we all have to be Bible majors?
No, I wasn't a Bible major. I'm an ag major.
We don't have photographic
I think
Good one, Dana.
I'm just saying. I think that there are based on what I see, the arguments I see being made by our brethren in the public sphere, is that they're making arguments that have no basis really in Scripture, only based on what they're parroting, what has been spoon-fed to them for a long time. And so it's really the question is an admonition to study. All right, now Luke 10:25 to 28. Speaking of ignorance of the Bible. Now, this is not a passage that details ignorance of the Bible. This is just the opposite. But I want to show you something here in this. All right? In Luke 10 and verse 25, it says, "Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him," that's Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said, "What is written in the law? What is your reading of it?" And he said, "Wait a minute, let me go get my Bible and give me 15 minutes to look it up." No, he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." In other words, that man turned and gave a very specific answer, right? 2 things. One about loving the Lord, and the other about loving your neighbor. All right, then what did Jesus say in response to him in verse number 28? You have answered rightly. All right? Which means there could have been a what? He could have been wrong. That's right. There was a possibility that he could have been wrong, but he was right. But now, those are the facts. Okay? Jesus asked him about the facts. You know, they asked him, "What's the greatest commandment in the law?" And he said, "Well, what do you read? What do you understand it to be? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself." You have answered right. But then look at the next phrase that follows that. Do this and live. So it's not just about knowing the facts. It's also about the organization of the facts. Because it's one thing to love the Lord your God, to say to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But it's another thing altogether to know what that means. And then to do it. It's one thing to know you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, but it's another thing to be able to organize the facts that what's the word I'm looking for? That accord with loving your neighbor as yourself. In other words, these things are facts, but then there's an organization of those facts that's also required. Jesus said, do this and live, which means there are things that you have to do in addition to just simply say, I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I love my neighbor as myself. So it's not just about knowing facts, all right? And the reason I mention that is there are a lot of people in the world that know a lot of facts about the Bible, right? I mean, you could, I just throw one, he's deceased now. You reckon Billy Graham knew a lot of facts about the Bible? Oh man, yeah. But did he did he have the organization of the facts of the Bible?
Well, he actually knew it. He just didn't do it.
Well, I have heard that, but that's been told, but it's never been documented. But I know what you're talking about, Bobby. But the point is that there are a lot of people who know a lot of facts about the Bible, but their organization of those facts is not correct, right? And so it's not just about, you can know a lot of facts about the Bible, but still be ignorant about the Bible if you don't know how to put them all together. I'll give you an example. When I worked for Co-op, and we had the section that I worked in at the warehouse, we carried just about every single kind of sprayer part you can imagine for every kind of farm implement. I mean, whether it be a John Deere sprayer or an International Harvester sprayer, or a Massey Ferguson, we just had this whole thing of sprayer parts, and you could ask me to go get any one of them, and I could go get it. All right, but if you ask me to put a sprayer together, I'm in a lot of trouble. In other words, I knew what all the parts were, but I didn't know how to put them together. I couldn't build a sprayer just because I knew what the parts were. And in the same way, a lot of people can know a lot about the Bible, but they don't know how to assemble it together to make it work. You might know a lot about car. Let me ask you this: how many of you would trust the guy at AutoZone to rebuild the engine on your car? Why not? He knows what all the parts are. Is that right? Probably not, because he's looking them up. Because he has to know the make, model, and how many seats are in your car before he can give you a windshield wiper. But you see what I'm saying. The knowledge of all the parts is not the knowledge of how to put the parts together. And the same thing goes for the Bible. It's not just the facts; it's the organization of the facts. And then letter C. Well, yeah.
They know.
Maybe.
But what I'm saying is the ones that are very...
Yeah, there are a lot of astute Bible students,
Right.
without question.
They know all the stories. They know they just put some things together wrong, but by the guidance of, a preacher that's feeding it.
Now, if we were all Trekkies, I'd make a reference to the menagerie, but that wouldn't mean anything to most of you, and you'll have to go look it up because I'm not going to explain it because it would take too long. But it's about, well, I'm not even going to, just look it up on your own. It's a great episode, by the way. It's like, if you gave me just about anything and told me to put it together, it ain't going to look like the picture. All right? Huh? Even if I had instructions, it's a coin toss. All right, but Rhonda puts almost everything together because I get so frustrated. I'll put it together with a hammer. I can hammer and nail it together. All right, so, all right, last thing on this. Jesus asked the question 5 times in 4 different accounts. Have you not read? Have you not read? In other words, he expected a level of knowledge. By the way, and by the way, he was saying this as a general to the religious leaders. He wasn't saying it to the rank and file, everyday member of the Jewish community. But he said to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, have you not read? Notice he expected them to know what their book, which was the Old Testament, he expected them to know what it said. He expected them to know what it said. And then, for example, and I'll get to this in just a minute, we'll talk about it in a different context, but in Matthew chapter 19, these so-called experts in the law said, with regard to divorce, why did Moses command us to give her a certificate of divorce and put her away? And Jesus said, oh, wait a minute, that's not what it was at all. Moses wasn't commanding you to divorce your wives, but because of the hardness of your heart, Moses permitted you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. See, they had the facts, but they didn't have them organized right. By the way, did not the devil produce facts in his temptation of Jesus? He shall give his angels charge concerning thee, and in their hands they shall bear thee up, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone. Psalm 91, about verse 11 and 12. He quoted the Bible word for word. He had the facts. Problem was he didn't have the organization of the facts. Because Jesus said, yep, but it says in another place, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And so, have you not read is an admonition for us as well. So number one, people do not see the Bible alike because there is an ignorance of the Bible. Then secondly is this: people do not understand the Bible alike because of their attitude toward the Bible. Now, I want to detail this in 3 things, all right, in 3 points. And the first is this: people believe the Bible is above human comprehension or beyond human comprehension. Whatever word you want to put in your blank there, above or beyond human comprehension. In other words, because, and I'm going to kind of summarize here and maybe speculate a little bit, because obviously I don't believe that the Bible is beyond human comprehension. I think that it's beyond human comprehension to know all of it, but that doesn't mean that it's beyond comprehension for us to know some or even most of it. But people say, well, because the Bible is so deep, you can't even drink from the top of it. Does that make sense? Because the Bible is so deep that I don't even want to wade in the shallow end. Because the whole thing is just beyond human comprehension. All right? Or they'll say, and I don't have this on your handout, they'll say, and it goes back to number one, well, because so many people don't agree on what the Bible says, therefore it must be beyond human comprehension. Do you see what I'm saying by that? People look at the religious world and say, look at all this religious division. The Bible must be beyond human comprehension. By the way, a number of weeks ago, I think I preached a sermon on this, and I know at least I used it as an example. There's kind of a well-known street preacher by the name of Cliff. I can't think of Cliff's last name. It's kind of an odd Germanic type name. He's got too many consonants and not enough vowels. All right? And or there's not enough vowels in between the consonants. All right? But this guy was on a podcast with a very well-known, is it Jake Paul's brother? But in any event, he's a kid, he's in his 20s, all right? Here's what this kid said. It's what he said, because they had Cliff as his guest, and it's a big podcast. He says, man, I look around, and I see so many different religions, that all claim to be Christianity. And I see some good things in pretty much all of them. He said, I don't pursue Christianity because I don't think I can know which one is right. Now, that's exactly what Jesus prayed in John 17, beginning in verse 20. Jesus prayed for his people to be unified so that everyone would believe that the Father had sent him. But the point is that how many millions of people, and in this day and time where there's just a complete lack of commitment to absolute truth, how many millions of people, and especially people under 40, don't even try to pursue Christianity because they see 15 different churches in a town of there's 6,500 people in Hamilton. How many churches you think there are in downtown Hamilton within a mile of the courthouse, or 4 or 5 miles of the courthouse? 20, 30. And so people see that. They see that and they say, I've never read the Bible in my whole life, and these people are reading the Bible and they can't get it. They can't agree with one another. Why would I even try? Why would I even try? And that's what that young man said. By the way, Cliff totally fumbled that one. He botched that answer horribly because Cliff didn't have an answer for denominationalism because he believes in it. And his answer was total nonsense. It's like I would have given anything to have been sitting on that couch with that dude and say, well, now that you've listened to Cliff bumble and stumble, let me just tell you a few very simple things that the Bible has to say about it. But they reject even pursuing the Bible because they see so much religious division. And the reason there's so much religious division is people, number one, are ignorant and they think that the Bible's beyond human comprehension. But I just gave you a few passages here, and by the way, I could have filled the page with these, all right? But for example, in John chapter 20, and I just want you to listen to the tone and the words of these texts, okay? If somebody was to say to you, I don't think anybody can understand the Bible. By the way, you reckon anybody's ever said that? I don't think any, you reckon anybody in Marion County, Alabama's ever said that, or at least thought it? Okay, we're all in agreement. So we read John chapter 20. By the way, this is what I would do. If somebody said that to me, I would just simply open the Bible and I'd point to some of these passages. Verse 30 of John chapter 20. And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Now, does that sound like we can't understand the Bible? Does that sound like we can't understand the Bible? Or does that sound like God gave us the Bible to read it and understand? He said that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, there's something beyond simple faith in Christ, and this book explains what those things are. And then if I was to go to the next chapter, as John closes out his gospel, in chapter 21, and in verses 24 and 25, this is the disciple who testifies of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. In other words, everything you read in this book is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. That sounds like the Bible's been given to us for a reason. To read, to know, to believe, and to be saved. Look at the next one in your list in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 4. Paul says to the brethren there, actually in verse 3 says, how that by revelation he has made known to me the mystery, as I have briefly written already, by which means what I have written, by which when you read, you may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ. Now, here's a man who's writing, who is telling his audience, I didn't learn what I'm writing to you. It was just given to me. I didn't have to study it. It was given to me. He said, and I've written it down. And when you read what I've written down, you're going to know everything that I know. And Paul says, I got my knowledge directly from God. He said the same thing in Galatians chapter 1. I didn't learn it. I wasn't taught it. I received it by revelation. In other words, it was given to me directly by God. And Paul says, I wrote it down. And when you read what I wrote down, you'll know exactly what I know. You'll understand what I understand. Doesn't sound like Paul was writing for people to not understand, or that it was some giant puzzle. In 1 Corinthians 14 and verse number 37, Paul is writing about spiritual gifts, starting in chapter 12. And he's fixing to close this lengthy discourse in his discussion of spiritual gifts. And in verse 37, he says, if any man thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, meaning having discernment, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. But if anyone is ignorant, let him be ignorant. So what Paul is saying here is, he's affirming that what he's writing is the commandment of the Lord. But he's also affirming that there are people in the church at Corinth who possessed spiritual discernment who could corroborate or confirm exactly what Paul had written as being the Word of God. That's what he's saying. He said there are people there that can absolutely confirm, because he says a prophet or spiritual. Not just anybody, a prophet or spiritual. Let him affirm that what I have written to you is the commandment of the Lord. So Paul is, again, writing so that people can understand. He wants them to understand. He expects them to understand. And again, I gave you the passage in Luke 10:29 again. You have rightly judged based on what you read. Remember, what is your reading? Well, this is my reading. You've rightly judged. Do that and live. So number one, they think it's beyond or above human comprehension in their attitude. Number two, they think it was never God's intent for everybody to agree on it. Now, that's just simply based on about 500 years of religious division. What people don't understand is, if we were just going to say there's been 2,000 years of Christianity, all right, and it's close to that, so we'll just use 2,000 years. That for about 1,500 years, there was unanimity on a number of biblical doctrines that people disagree with wildly in the last 500. For example, it was universally believed you had to be baptized in order to be saved for 1,500 years. It was universally believed. And anybody that denied the necessity of baptism for remission of sins was deemed a heretic. Look, just read the writings of the Ante-Nicene Fathers on the subject of baptism with regard to the Gnostics and some of these other heretics. They said anybody that denies baptism is a heretic. So now look, that's not to say that they got everything else right, because we know they introduced pouring water, and then they introduced sprinkling water, and then they introduced the sprinkling infants. I'm not saying they got everything right about baptism, but they all got one thing right. And that was that baptism was necessary for the remission of sins. In fact, many of the Ante-Nicenes referred to baptism, used the word baptism and grace interchangeably. They said baptism is the grace of God, which, by the way, they didn't come up with that on their own. Titus read it from Paul's pen, long before that. But the point is, baptism was universally understood to bring remission of sins for 1,500 years. Then Ulrich Zwingli in about the early 16th century and the early 1500s, he says, and he wrote it down, everybody's been wrong for 1,500 years. That's what the man said. Everybody's been wrong for 1,500 years, but I got it right. Look, anytime somebody comes up with something, they say everybody else has been wrong for 1,500 years, but I got it right. That's, you might want to take that one with a grain of salt, right?
It's just like everything else in this world. I mean, for our whole lives, we only had boys and girls, and now we've got all different kinds. I mean, it's just like anything else. People now are not satisfied with the way things have always been.
And by the way, a lot of the foolishness that we're having to deal with now also is sourced in religious division. In other words, the religious division, especially during the late 1700s and early 1800s with this Great Awakening, held up the human experience as being above everything else. In other words, it was what Rush Limbaugh referred to as rugged individualism. And in many ways, rugged individualism made America what it is. In other words, people, pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and forging their own way ahead. The problem was that mindset found its way into religion, and that my religious experience takes precedent over anything you can read to me in this book, because I know what I feel in my heart. I know you're reading this to me, but I know what I feel in my heart. And I wouldn't trade this feeling in my heart for a stack of Bibles this high.
Just like homosexuality.
All right?
It was wrong forever.
It's been wrong forever.
For everybody.
But again, it goes to the exaltation of the individual.
Yes.
I mean, but religious division also was a result of the exaltation of the individual. And so I'm not saying that one created the other. I'm saying the mindset is the same. All right. And so, by the way, let me just chase a quick rabbit here on that. When we read things, some of the things that we read about in the New Testament, for example, in 1 Timothy 4, talking about forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats and those types of things, we immediately go, in our minds, we go to Roman Catholicism because they teach those things. Just remember this. I don't think Paul's talking about Roman Catholicism in 1 Timothy chapter 4. He's talking about the mindset that lended itself into the formation of Roman Catholicism. Now, Roman Catholicism didn't take its present form for hundreds of years till after the days of the New Testament. But the mindset of Gnosticism and asceticism and those types of things were present in the world, and those attitudes manifested themselves eventually in Roman Catholicism. Now look, there are some things where I think Paul's talking about Roman Catholicism. I'm going to make a case for 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, even though not everybody agrees with that, and that's fine. But what I'm saying is a lot of things that we read in the Bible, we get to see them manifested in other things, even though Paul wasn't talking about specifically about those religions. He was talking about the mindset that led to those types of things in religion. I mean, do you think Jesus was talking about Roman Catholicism when he, and the rosary when he was talking about prayer in Matthew chapter 6? They think they shall be heard for, don't use vain repetitions as the heathen do. All right, what was that? Well, what happened was the mindset of the heathen found its way into the apostasy, which eventually became known as Roman Catholicism. And so don't read too much into the scriptures on these things. Just look that there's a mindset that will manifest itself in a number of areas. For example, in religious division, and now in this biological division that makes absolutely no sense to anyone. All right? So they say it's never God's intent for people to understand the Bible alike. But Paul made two statements in 1 Corinthians. One is, everybody speak the same thing. There be no divisions among you, and you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. Now that kind of sounds like unity of thought, kind of like what Jesus prayed for in John 17. And then in 1 Corinthians 4:17, he spoke about the things that I preach everywhere in every church. In other words, Paul's message was consistent everywhere he went. He preached the same thing in every church. By the way, if it was never God's intent for men to understand the Bible alike, why do we even have the book of Romans through the book of Revelation? Because almost every single one of those books was written to correct some error in religious thinking and practice. Not all of them. Some sections, for example, some sections are more warnings than they are corrective. For example, when I read Philippians and Colossians, I see those more as warnings against certain philosophies and ways of thinking as opposed to correcting the entire church. But then you read Corinthians and it's just like every chapter is a new religious error. But much of the rest of the New Testament following the book of Acts was written to correct wrong thinking and wrong practice, which leads me to believe God expects us to believe the same thing. And if it wasn't that important, He wouldn't have those books written. All right? And then lastly is that just people they think it's unnecessary. It's just not necessary for everybody to believe the same thing. Well, that goes back to number one, right? Only a person who's ignorant of the Bible could ever draw the conclusion that it's not necessary for us to believe the same thing. I mean, how could anybody read the prayer of Jesus in John 17 that they may be one as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world might believe that thou hast sent me? John 17:20. How does one read that passage and not draw the conclusion that we're all supposed to believe the same thing? How do we read? It's an ignorance of that passage. It's an ignorance of the passage in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse number 10 that I just mentioned. Speak the same thing, be no divisions among you, be perfectly joined together, same mind, the same judgment. I got the order reversed on the last two, but all three of those things are in there. So the idea that it was never God's intent really gives way to the fact that in and of itself is an ignorance of the Scriptures. All right, it is 6:25. I didn't get nearly as far as I thought I was going to. Got off on my pop quiz and killed some time on that one. All right, hold on to these. 2 weeks, we'll come back to number 3. We'll get as far as we can. 2 Sunday nights. And I'm assuming that those will probably go kind of like these. And then, it might be the next couple of Sunday nights before we get through this. But hold on to these, because I think this is very important for us to understand as we deal with people that don't think it's necessary for us to believe and practice the same thing. All right, let me get this turned off. Go ahead and turn your